My name is Oh, sorry. My name is Ashali. I lead our Future Cities program and People's Urban Living Lab at Transitions Research. For those of you who are new to our dialogues, Transitions Research is a social science research collective examining the complex interplay between technology, society, and sustainability. We generate anticipatory knowledge, co-create solutions, and strengthen capacity to drive transition trajectories towards a just and sustainable future for India. We center people, engage with plural perspectives, and shape human choice to democratize technological change. Our Talking About Transitions dialogue series features critical conversations on the systemic shifts at the interplay of tech, society, and sustainability. Today, we have a distinguished panel of experts joining us to delve into the critical intersection of the power dynamics and imaginaries surrounding urban resilience. Before we get started, I'd like to briefly introduce our panelists. First, we have Dr. Lizzie Yarina, who's the assistant professor at the School of Architecture at Northeastern University. She is a designer and planner whose work explores the relationship between environmental risk and spatial politics. Her research reveals how large-scale resilience projects are underpinned by the technocratic norms of climate change planning industry. These norms in turn shape the ways our world is being reshaped in the light of environmental crises. Next, we have Ms. Ritu Bharadwaj, Principal Research on Climate Change at the International Institute for Environment and Development. She has more than 18 years of senior policy development, research, and management experience in government funding agencies and international NGOs. She's worked extensively on social protection, climate resilience, forest and watershed management, and livelihood and gender issues. Finally, we have Dr. Amir Bashir, the lead of practice at the Indian Institute for Human Settlements, who works on issues at the intersection of economics, climate change mitigation, adaptation, and sustainable development. He has substantial experience working with the various integrated assessment frameworks and modeling arrangements. His current research interests are low carbon societies and infrastructure, climate change adaptation and mitigation, with a specific focus on urban climate change linkages, climate, energy, and environmental policy. This conversation will be moderated by our in-house research fellow, Dr. Prerna Singh. Her work focuses on adaptation and resilience research, monitoring and evaluation, and multi-stakeholder collaboration for a step change in adaptation as part of the Adaptation Research Alliance. Before I hand the mic over to Prerna, I want to just inform everyone that the Q&A box is available. We will be having a few rounds of questions that are moderated with our panelists, and then we'll be opening the floor up questions. So feel free during the course of the conversation to put in your questions, thoughts for all of our speakers in the Q&A box. Thanks so much. And Prerna, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ashali, for welcoming our panelists and for giving a brief background on the series itself. Today's dialogue examines and questions the predominant narratives and visions of resilience in Indian cities. What are the imaginaries or factors that are shaping urban futures? What form of engagement are needed to ensure that marginal perspectives and communities vulnerable to climate impact can co-create and shape their own future? We will focus on addressing real trade-offs where resilience infrastructure has led to displacement and further marginalization of communities to discover pathways that are more inclusive and equitable in planning for climate risks. We'll go through each panelist's thought on the broad topic first, and then we'll delve deeper into expertise of our individual panelists on a range of aspects on this defining the imaginaries of urban resilience. We'll spend around 5 minutes for individual responses, and I'll keep a track of time and raise my hand in Zoom when 1 minute is left. The audience, as Ashali mentioned, feel free to enter your questions at any time in the questions box, and we'll go over them towards the end. So to kickstart things, I will ask each panelist here, in your experience working in this space, what are the power dynamics at play in how resilience is being framed and pursued in India and in cities of global south in general? Let's start with Amir.
I was not expecting this. With two other panelists, but nevertheless, since you have put me on the hot spot, I think my first response to this would be that this is still a work in progress, at least in Indian cities. I think there are too many moving parts, and we are still trying to bring those moving parts uh, in a coherent framework or coherent response framework. And uh, and I'll touch upon three things to make my point here. The first the first point that I'd like to make is that in contemporary India, and particularly in Indian cities, we are actually grappling with multiple simultaneous transitions. So there's energy transition, of course, played out in complex ways, but there are other transitions also. Structural transformation transition is happening, and then there's an educational transition that is happening. There's a health transition that is happening. So there are these multiple transitions and happening simultaneously, which is making things mm, very complex and not easy. So the puzzle is getting increasingly very complicated, and there's of course some things working somewhere may not work in a general sense. So that's one point. Number one. Point number two is I think there's also this very palpable tension, at least the way policy making in Indian cities and the response to the transition is playing out. And the tension is, and it's a positive tension because we don't have a very clear handle on it, is that uh, should we go the infrastructure top-heavy route, or should we kind of give primacy to, say, for example, fixing service deliveries or basic service provision and try and make things more equitable and fair? And I think the tension is quite prominently visible uh, because the mediating factor is a little confusing here. For example, things that connect the two is, in my opinion, economic development, economic activity, livelihoods, those kinds of things. And in particularly in Indian cities, which are, barring a few, largely characterized by massive informal economic activity, that connection is in a flux. And we are still grappling with that. How do we bring these bottom-up and top-down approaches together? And that is still a work in progress, etc. And um, and and I think um, um, nothing is like cast in stone at this moment. Like it's an iterative process, and uh, it will take some time before it settles down. So there's this big city phenomena, small city phenomena, medium-sized cities phenomena. There's no uniformity here. So that's like the second most important thing. And the third important thing is, I think, because of the proximate climate-induced challenges, uh, the politics is getting increasingly quite strong in the local context. And right now, what I see is quick fixes. There's no comprehensive and clear-cut response. But I see it as a very important moment in contemporary India. But we don't have the administrative structures in place which could leverage this and create a mechanism for resilience planning which is rooted in in the local context in which people are operating. So there is an opportunity, but we are still grappling with how do we leverage this opportunities. And finally, I think uh, just coming back and closing the loop and to my first point, I think what is clear is that we need a response to uh, climate-induced risks and other kinds of risks. But we also need to respond to the development crisis that we see in our cities. And therefore, we need to think in a particular way. So we need to, so standalone subsystem needs to transition or transform is not going to help us anymore. So the entire system needs to first transition and then transform, which will require a very clear thinking with how the transition story is linking back to key risks, both in the present time and in the future, and what's the option space that exists, and how that option space intersects with policy, economic outcomes, social and institutional structures, uh, geophysical possibilities, etc. And then all of that, how helps us in addressing development risks. So how does all our intervention help in alleviating poverty, inequality, create jobs? So that connection has to be established in a systemic way. So finally, I think uh, what I would say is that it's it's a moment in contemporary India where we need deep systemic transformation, and I think we are too fragmented. Uh, that won't work anymore. I'll stop here.
Thanks, Amir. Thanks so much for shedding light on the complexities here, and also being, cautiously optimistic and leveraging the moment. I'll ask Ritu now, what is your take on this? Whose vision is shaping the paradigms of urban resilience, and who is missing in this narrative?
I would say, firstly, I have to say that I'm not at my usual place. I'm traveling, so I don't know whether it does keep popping up a message saying that my internet is a bit shaky. So if you don't hear me, just let me know. Okay. Okay. So firstly, I think Amir touched upon a lot of points, but what I would say is right now, there are no imaginaries really shaping anything. Everything is happening in a very haphazard manner. Tend to agree with what Amir said. Everything is in a transition, but this transition has been going on for a very long time, and we have to, like, right now we can't say that we can continue in this process and something will settle down, because things haven't settled down for a very long time. And I would say, like, I myself belong to a state called Bihar, which is like, it's a migration-driven state. The whole economy depends on migration. You'll find a Bihari everywhere. So, but there was a time when it used to be opportunistic migration. But now, if you look globally, the trend that we are seeing, like I myself do a lot of research in the global south, and we picked up 12 geographies in Asia, Africa, and Pacific. And one thing that emerged, irrespective of type of climate impacts, was whether it was slow onset or rapid onset, forced displacement and distress migration was a common feature across the geography. So it's not just about India or about South Asia, it's happening everywhere. But what we are not doing is, we are not incorporating this trend in our planning in any way. Urban planning, even in the climate planning, which should have considered this factor. We like year before last, we conducted a research on how climate was driving migration and how those migrants were becoming vulnerable to being trafficked or human rights violation, forced labor, exploitative labor. And it was the data was like really revealing in its sense, because what we saw was in areas like Palamo, where there was traditional marginalization based on caste, and which was traditionally poor or marginalized, there people coming from those areas were much more vulnerable to being trafficked or much more vulnerable to being exploited in the destination site compared to rapid onset event areas like Kendrapada. But what we were surprised to see was migration was such a big feature in both Odisha and in Jharkhand. But did their state action plan cover migration? No. Were the cities prepared? No. Where the destinations where they were going to, all the states where these migrants were going to, did they even account for migrants? No. I did not see migration featuring in any of the national adaptation plan or in or state change action plan. No. Important figure in the recent time which has come out from World Bank research, which says in the groundswell report, says 218 million people will be vulnerable. My connection was a bit unstable in between. So what it says that 218 million people would be internally displaced by 2050. Now, we have to be prepared. Now, in our own research from Bangladesh, we saw that in Oridchar was an area where every household had been displaced minimum 3 to maximum 7 times. Now, as it happens, like every time a family gets displaced, they want to move further away because they don't want to be crisis or conflict. So they want to move to a much further location. And where do they all end up? In Dhaka, the tier one city. So what we are not doing, migrants would come in. It is not. And therefore, we need to prepare more of our tier 2 and tier 3 cities in a way that you make and there's one more factor that was really going to influence, and especially after the COP28 discussion, and something that Amir touched upon as well, the transition. And the just transition, the coal-based transition, that is also going to create a lot of migrants. And where will they flow? They'll go either to economic centers or they're going to move to urban locations. So we have to be like, these are imaginaries, or these are the issues that are going to drive not urbanization in a planned way, but urbanization in an unplanned way. And more of these informal settlements would come up. And what, of course, there are a lot of data and trends that say that, by 2050, so much urbanization would happen. But the problem here is the urban poor population is rising at a much faster rate than urbanization itself. And therefore, we need to be more cautious about it. So I'll just leave it there. There are a couple of more points, but I just want to, probably cover it as we go about discussing more issues.
Thanks so much, Ritu. And very well put with the need to not just prepare the tier 1 megacity, but also tier 2 and 3 in the organically growing cities. Lizzie, what is your take on this power dynamics at play and how resilience is being framed and pursued?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. Also, thanks for the invitation to be here. I think a lot of what the other panelists have said already has resonated. And I think, so my work is not in India, primarily in Southeast Asia. So I'll kind of speak from that perspective. And I think some things may apply. And in my work, I've really seen 3 kind of actors able to kind of shape the discourse and imaginaries of what climate adaptation looks like in these sites. And this is both urban adaptation and also regional adaptation. Of course, state actors, right? And state actors are often working with aid and financial organizations. And they often, I think, at least from what I've observed, often what's framed as climate adaptation today really has a lot to do with what has been development as usual over the last, since Bretton Woods kind of, so the last 70 years or something on the one hand. And then, we also have, at least in the sites where I've worked, you see technical experts playing a pretty significant, important role and especially international technical experts, although local experts as well, although they have different kind of valences. So I sometimes think that on the one hand, these actors maybe are bringing other ideas about what adaptation might mean, but they become also extremely technocratic. And then I think one thing that you see is when you kind of put these two the kind of state and multilateral actors and the kind of technical experts together, is the technical experts often very easily ignore the kind of bigger issues of power and politics that those other actors have. Yeah, so I'll stop there. I apologize, a little early here, so if I seem a little groggy, it's not for lack of interest.
We're very happy to have you here, Lizzie, and good morning to you. And very important points made on different types of actors playing a role here and their background, bringing in biases and perspectives tailored to them, and might be missing out on the bigger picture and the big aspects of system. So thank you all on your insightful remarks on the topic. Let's dive deeper into our discussion here. And I'll start with Ritu. How do you think climate resilience can be institutionalized as a key component of social planning and social policy development? And what perspectives, in your opinion, are critical in reimagining urban resilience as part of social policy?
Thanks for that question. Actually, this is something which I've been driving home a lot in a lot of discussion is, I've been in this space for a while now, and I remember my discussion with the ministries, when we went and had a discussion, we always went and talked to the Ministry of Environment and Forest. So climate change 10 years back, a sectoral issue. Now climate is not a sectoral issue, it's a mainstream issue. Almost none of the sector, you talk about health, you talk about education, you talk about social development, gender empowerment, everything is getting impacted by climate change. So there's not one thing that you can talk about without talking about climate-related planning or resilience planning. So that is one thing. And the second thing is, I do a lot of work on the climate change loss and damage issue. And loss and damage, for many of you who are I'm sure loss and damage has been so much in discussion, everyone now knows what it is. But about 2 years back, loss and damage was a very contentious and a sticky issue. Nobody wanted to talk about it. But so, and also we know that there's no standardized definition for loss and damage. So then we started organizing a series of deliberative dialogue, not with the people who actually sat in negotiations, but with people who were dealing with it on the front line, the humanitarian actors, the people who the grassroots women organization and so on. And then we asked them to define what is loss and damage. And what they said was loss and damage occurs because adaptation sometimes is not implemented effectively. They're not optimally implemented, either because of lack of resources or because people just don't integrate climate risks into the planning process. So, and the other thing I would really say is, let's just step back and see what is the context in which climate really impacts communities. It is impacting communities, especially in the global south, within the context of development deficits. So there's marginalization, there's lack of access to institutions which are making decisions, there's lack of political maturity. And you talk about social planning, there is not even social protection program in many countries. Now, fortunately in India, we have a fairly well-developed social protection programs, but there's so many other countries, we heard about Southeast Asia. There's so many countries where it's not even in the nascent stage. So what I would say within the social planning, there's a 3P framework that we talk about all the time, that we need to do the social planning with that 3P framework, which we say predisposing, precipitating, and protective factor. So when you're talking about dealing with climate crisis, we need to understand what are the predisposing factors. So predisposing factors in the sense of demographic indicators, like what's the level of literacy, skill level, sex ratio, education level, or people's land holding, whether they have irrigation. The existing predisposing factor. And what's the state of the protective factor? So in places, for example, in India, we have MGNREGS scheme, which provides livelihood security. You have PDS scheme, which provides food security. You have health scheme. So you have a range of protective factors. But despite having these protective factors, as per regulation, because in India, a lot of these social protection programs are rights-based, but despite that, not everybody has the same level of access to these rights-based social protection program. So, we have to, therefore, we have to really understand the predisposing, precipitating, and the state of protective factor, which makes not just India, the whole of global South, not even South Asia or Southeast Asia, the whole of global South, the major population is dependent on natural resource-based livelihoods, which is agriculture, fishery, forestry, and all of these are seasonal in nature, which means, one, they are seasonal, two, they are more vulnerable to climate. But when we say seasonal, so when they get impacted by climate crisis more because they, as I said, development deficit. So they're not irrigation facility, they are not enough supply chains for value-added products coming out of these natural resource-based livelihoods and so on. But also migration, I keep going back to, because migration is an area where I really work a lot. And one thing that keeps coming out is people don't even incorporate migration. Like MGNREGS scheme in India, it's a, I remember because I was myself in the government at that time. I worked in government for 8 years. And when MGNREGS program was being launched, it was all about providing livelihoods during off season. But within the whole of MGNREGS legislate or act or any of their rules or operational guidelines which comes out every year, migration is not even mentioned once. Which means like we have to give migration more centrality within the whole planning process, especially climate risk management process, because we don't incorporate that, you are leaving a lot of social issues unattended because migration leads to breaking of the families. There are adults who migrate, leaving women and children or elderly behind. They left to fend for themselves. Even men or adults who are migrating in urban centers, they don't have facility. Then it leads to a whole lot of other health and education within the whole planning process. And the third, I would say that we focus a lot on natural resource management. I myself say a lot about like how can we really take our landscapes from drought, like from year on year drought relief to more drought proofing or flood resilience. But we also need to focus a lot on human resource development. So along with NRM, we need HRD, human resource development, and human resource development more in terms of skill development, more in terms of especially mapping out where we'll really see some of these migrants flows in urban context and where would their skills really match, because most of these people all their lives they've done agriculture, fishery, forestry, and when they come in the urban centers, all they know how to do is unskilled manual labor. So there is a level to which you can one, absorb them in the economy, but if you want them to really provide a gainful contribution to the economy, you have to do that skill mapping and that skill matching as well. I'll just stop there, Prerna.
So very insightful and on the ground information, right? That should be driving policy development. So transitioning from policy to methods and approaches, I'd like to ask Amir, how can urban planners and policymakers effectively integrate bottom-up approaches in residence planning to ensure that diverse community voices are heard and incorporated in strategies for urban climate adaptation?
I don't know. So we are ourselves grappling with this, and there's no clear formula here. But a few ideas that at least I believe in could be attempted, which Ritu also tried to touch upon. I think we need to first, I think, make a clear distinction between the hardware of response and the software of response. I think that's, in my view, very important. And one of the things that COVID has done has brought human development right in the center. So people have started talking about food, access to food. People have started to talk about livelihoods, livelihood protection, healthcare, educational continuity, etc. And I think these are very important foundational elements on which you build an economy or economic structures, etc. So uh, I think we have to bring uh, human development dimensions as the central pivot around which we could start thinking, we could attempt to start thinking about localized climate resilience planning, etc., etc. That's the first point that I like to make. The second point is that which we are struggling in India. So I think what we need to understand and realize is that in Indian cities, there is an administrative structure that is in place, and that administrative structure is not your climate or disaster governance structure. So we need to create a structure which is responsive to the risks that we see in cities that doesn't exist. And it brings us to this whole question of, do we have the technical capacity to plan? Do we have the technical capacity or or specific capacities to think about future, etc., etc. And I think there's a lot of work that we need to do in this space. Uh, and that is still work in progress. A lot of attempts have been made, but these are all fragmented responses. I would reserve my opinion on whether it has to be a private response or a public response, and what kind of mechanisms would moderate that. I think it's too early and too soon. Uh, uh, we can't be sure at this moment. So I would not articulate for that. Adaptation, risk and resilience is a public endeavor, and we should try and think about it as a public initiative or a public intervention project. Third, I think what is important is, and I have been talking a lot about this, is that uh, we need um, uh, we need to generate social demand for resilience. And I think that social demand would require systematic assessments, which are not uh, like what you say, uh, not anecdotal, but is backed by concrete evidence. And that's what the civil society and think tanks and research organizations do. Try and create an evidence base. Just a minute. Try and create an evidence base that helps create the social demand for resilience. And I think that is still missing. We don't have disaggregated data. Ritu also touched upon this. Uh, we need to generate a lot of information, a lot of evidence, uh, and we have to do it in a very localized manner. That is still lacking, and uh, this is something that we need to spend more time on. Fourth point that I'd like to make is that sometimes it is prudent to kind of pick your battles. So, for example, is it water that we fight through this? Is it housing that we fight through this? I think energies are focused, responses are focused, and we can make those concrete connections with other dimensions. And we need to prioritize our battles and try and win battles incrementally, and not at everything should happen simultaneously. I think that's at least a utopian idea in an Indian context. We have to be very pragmatic about what we fight for. So these four things, I'll stop.
And very well made points on the fact that we need to have a pragmatic approach on this, and also strong evidence to build that social demand of resilience. So on that point, I just had a follow-up question. In your experience, have you seen some examples of these evidence of good practices that include diverse voices for climate action or climate resilience planning? I mean, that's a follow-up question to you. Just have stepped off. So we're going to circle back to it. But I'm going to move to Lizzie. And I wanted to ask, given that there are a lot of diverse actors involved in climate adaptation and urban planning, how do factors like power influence how imaginaries of resilience are shaped?
Yeah, I think, to kind of reiterate a little bit what I said already, adaptation is always both technical and political project. So I think, when we see the kind of prospect on the horizon that there might be some need for large-scale projects, large-scale plans, then any actors who might have an interest in creating large-scale projects and large-scale plans are, of course, going to have a stake in how those kind of projects get shaped. And I think there's, one thing that Amir said earlier that I kind of thought was interesting, this point about, do we need big projects, or do we need to kind of maybe do maintenance, maybe think about kind of less glamorous things that are still needed on the ground that have to do with very basic things like sanitation or, maintaining infrastructure that already exists, or even identifying infrastructure that has been built that's actually creating current environmental problems, something like that. And I think, one reason why often, at least in my experience with climate adaptation, you see the kind of the interest in these climate adaptation mega projects is because those are things that can kind of, they're more perceptible, and so therefore become the kind of more weighty in their ability to kind of shape public opinion, and their ability to kind of generate media attention, or also create large scale funding, which then also has its own interests, why various actors would be interested in that. So I think, how does power shape it? I think it shapes it at every single level and dimension. And I think, maybe to kind of circle back to the conversation about participation too a little bit. I mean, this is, a little bit different in the context where I'm working, because it's not Vietnam, which is my primary research site at the moment. It's not a democracy. So ideas of what participation might mean are quite different. But I find, one thing that various actors do is they often use citizens as a justification for various interventions, that this is going to serve, the farmer, the poor urban resident best. But those claims are often made without any perspective or connection to actually what's happening on the ground. And sometimes I would talk to experts or officials in Hanoi or in the Netherlands, and they would say, oh, I'm lucky if I talk to one farmer per year, or you know more about this city in the Mekong Delta than I do. And I thought, okay, well, I'm not, that shouldn't be true. So I think, these kind of are also shaped or kind of linked to this kind of bigger question of who gets to have a voice in what future their city or landscape has.
Absolutely. I definitely resonated with the fact that we're not the power play on this is on the glamorous aspects of building resilience, like mega infrastructure and everything that looks good and shapes politics. In that line, how do you recommend on how do we navigate and overcome these vested interests and power dynamics in distribution of resources and building coping capacity in local communities?
Yeah, I think part of that, I would respond and say, like, who is the we here? Because I think that, and even the, who am I, like, and I could be a researcher or I could be an activist in my community. So I think, and also the kind of larger political context of the site, I think also really kind of shape how I would want to answer that question. Yeah.
I would say when we talk about when transitions research is saying how can we build it, we're thinking about actors from the vulnerable communities and the local communities so that we can share all the knowledge that we're gathering from all of you to them.
Yeah. One thing I like to say is you can't see everyone or everything from the top, but you also can't see everyone or everything from the bottom. And so, I think that allowing the people who will be impacted by plans and projects to have a role in shaping those plans and projects is essential. And I think they also have a lot of knowledge about what, Ritu made a comment earlier about, exposure to weather or the elements as being something that is a characteristic of the most vulnerable and also making them most needing to adapt. I would add that, that condition often has made those actors very savvy adapters in their own lives and in their own right, because the environment is not something they can separate themselves from in the way that, maybe I can by, putting in an air conditioning unit and turning on the heat, right? And do whatever. I don't have to go outside to do, necessarily my work. So, sorry, am I losing the train a little bit? So I think it's really important to integrate that knowledge. But I think one thing that to me makes thinking about adaptation really interesting is its kind of scalar dimensions, where something that might be a really good adaptation for one space or one community, however we want to define that, some just discrete region or discrete group of people might actually be very bad for an adjacent or downstream group of people. And so I think that's where I think the kind of role of planners can be, is like really thinking about a kind of mediation between a kind of bottom-up view and a top-down view.
Thanks, Lizzie. That makes a lot of sense. And I also see a connecting thread between all three of our panelists on looking at things in the cross-section and looking at it from a more system perspective for urban planners. I will hold my questions in the interest of audience questions. And this one I'll pose for Ritu. How do we incorporate informality, especially informal settlements, when we're thinking about resident cities? What would be your thoughts towards urban planners and officials in incorporating informal settlements and informality in urban residents?
There's something that we did in a year back when we started telling how do we really manage the situation, the informality. And the problem here is, what is informality? We have to define that. And the informality is basically where you have workers, you have the workforce who are contributing to the economy, but you just don't recognize them. And even in many of the government projects, you will see there's so many people who are employed. Majority of the people are employed in the infrastructure projects, which are run by government. They are run by the PWD, Public Works Department, and all these other ministries. But even they want to engage with the recognize, I understand their point that they can't put all the 500 workers who work on a short term on a permanent payroll. But, there are ways in which you can make it formal. For example, you walk into any government organization or ministry, you see those biometric thumb impression. And you also see, like in many of these, and I was surprised, I have a flat in Noida, and I go there, any construction that is happening now, they're mandated to have toilets. So almost every construction site, you'll now see temporary toilets put up for the workers there. So things are changing. I'm not saying things are not changing, but yeah, it is in terms of providing them some decent facility. And probably they are providing toilets so that other formal establishments, they don't have to see people like easing themselves up in the morning. So probably that's the reason why those solutions have really come into force. But what I'm saying is, you go into a mobile store, you have to buy a SIM. You just put your thumb on a small gadget and you get a SIM. All your details are verified. In India, especially right now, everyone has an Aadhaar card. Everyone has a biometric identity. Just need to put in a small thing there. And if you can just put those biometric readers on every construction site, or just mandate them, don't put them on your payroll, but at least how many people are working with you. You can at least cover them under social protection program when so that they're covered under health insurance, they're covered under accidental insurance. We work very closely with one of our partners in Jharkhand who run this migrant helpline. And one thing that really stuck with me was, we were doing this research on climate migration and trafficking. And there's a woman who came up to me and who told me that, see, this is my husband's Aadhaar card. This is my husband. And he hasn't called me back for 3 months. And I inquired what must have happened to the husband. And they said he probably died at the destination site. And the contractor did not feel it necessary to report back to the family, because in that case, he would have to give compensation. So can you imagine a family going through this trauma of not knowing whether the husband has died or not? So this happens because you keep them informal. And I'm saying that there are so many government programs which do cover all these informal workers, but just because they are invisible, their work, they're not even recognized within the formal system. They don't get covered under these. And the other thing I would say, to cover informality or to deal with this informality, you have to bring together the social protection and informal labor market reform, which Amir did say that during COVID times, because of the sea of migrant workers returning, for the first time, people started recognizing that there are so many people who are in our cities, living in the cities, but who are informal. We don't even recognize them. So how do you bring together the social protection and informal labor market reforms together? And for that, what you would also need is to bring in portability in social protection program. One thing has happened, like the PDS scheme, the food security scheme, one nation, one ration card. That is a step in the right direction, but probably that needs to come into every scheme, every social protection scheme. And also to deal with some of the operational issues, operational challenges that are associated still with this portability scheme. But I'll just stop there, let others come in as well.
Thanks for sharing that. I think there's very relevant points on in a way, defining what is informal employment and informality in the system. And maybe learning from the social reforms that have taken a step in the right direction here and translating it into climate resilience. I will have another question from our audience, and this is to Amir. Are there any institutional mechanisms for social feedback within city governments? We see a lot of global focus on monitoring, evaluation, and learning, the MEL systems. How do city governments right now are doing the learning piece of MEL?
So before I come to this question, I like to add to what Ritu was saying earlier. So the first point, and Ritu also touched upon it, that when we are thinking about adaptation and resilience, we need to make a very clear distinction between poverty and vulnerability. So there are so many vulnerable and right on the edge, which COVID showed us. They may not be recorded poor. So I think that's a very important definitional task that we have to do for our cities. If we need to understand what Lizzie was also talking about, adaptation of whom and adaptation for what. So for that, we need to first understand what the vulnerabilities are, rather than just go by what my poverty numbers are, which are anyways quite in flux. Second point, just to add on to what Lizzie and Ritu have already spoken, is that we need to make this very clear distinction between in the context of climate risk management. And the distinction is that on one side is the carbon story, which is coming back at us, but that's also a very tech private sector story. But on the other side, where the risks are being experienced in multiple forms, and that is a poverty, inequality, job story. So the mechanisms to handle both of this are different. And the only way in which both of these should come back, can connect, is through strong politics. So the politics has to be strengthened. And therefore, this MEL system, like ordinarily speaking, like it's like people like Ritu, me, who have been working in these places over so many decades, trying to generate evidence and becoming some kind of a knowledge intermediary, and trying to bring issues to the fore, to the establishment, to the administrative setup. Having said so, I think what we need to understand is that there are many ways in which social learning is happening. There are many ways in which feedback is going to the system. Right now, if you look at what is happening in Indian cities, feedback is the mechanism of feedback is, for example, in the context of disasters, is have people lost their lives, or is there damage to assets? Is there a property damage? Now, we need to recognize that what are the ways in which feedback or the language of feedback can be coded. Now, if we talk to to an administrator who is thinking about an intervention, the questions that would be asked is okay, how much it is going to cost me, and will it help in generating political dividends, or is it easy to segregate who is benefiting from this and who is not benefiting from this? So is there leakage, etc.? So there is a certain way or a certain language which helps us communicate and articulate. That language we have to discover. It's a work in progress. It's not easy to uh, write codes around it, but we have to figure out, and we have to identify that language through which feedback from the ground flows to the top. So the question is not about feedback. The question is more about language and the calculus around that language. And that has to be uh, clarified in such a manner that the legal administrative system understands. So there is a lot of anecdotal evidence and hullabaloo around certain things, but that is not the language that administrators understand. there has to be some translation in between. And that is our job, which we have been doing, jobs of academicians, universities, civil society actors. So this we call in academic terms institutional work. The idea of institutional work has to be strengthened, and it has to be expanded. There has to be there has to be innovative ways discovered where multiple people can come together and strengthen this articulation.
Thank you so much, Amir. That makes a lot of sense. And you're right. I mean, there needs to be a lot of translation of concepts for all the diverse actors to be able to understand what we're talking about. I take one last question from the audience, and this is directed to Lizzie. Future thinking, scenario planning can help envision, preferred futures and the futures that would happen based on climate change impacts. And all of this needs to be done in like a participative and representative way. To what extent is there interest in applying these scenario-based planning and inclusive scenario-based planning and methodologies? And would this be of interest, and who would, to whom?
Yeah, I think scenario planning certainly is a tool among many tools. And I think I've not been exposed to any examples that really have succeeded in these ideas of inclusivity, but I think it's certainly possible. Of course, it's inevitably whoever is designing a scenario planning workshop is also setting certain parameters for what definitions of, as we've been kind of talking, definitions of vulnerability might mean, definitions of adaptation might mean. And, perhaps there's a way to expand that up too. But I think I was thinking that it's almost like, I think a lot about kind of literal mapping and how this is kind of Borges' story about the impossibility of creating a one-to-one map, because if you were able to, you would have recreated the world. And I wonder if you could say something similar about kind of scenario thinking, that if you were really to kind of get the full worldview of every single person who might possibly be implicated by any decision, I think some of these scale things also come into the story. Would everybody just have to be spending all of their time also contributing to scenario planning? So I think certainly it's a tool like many tools, and I think can be certainly used well. So I'm sorry if that's a somewhat unsatisfying answer.
That makes sense. So now, as we are at time, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time here. So as we approach the end of our dialogue, I'll once again sincerely thank all of our panelists and our attendees for this engaging and insightful conversation. The conversation is far from over. We are getting more questions, and we will take them and get responses and share it. And as we uncover these complexities of politics, power, presidents, equity, and social planning, we invite all of our panelists and audience to continue the conversation with, and extend partnerships and collaborations as we move forward. The journey towards resilient urban future demands a collective commitment. So I think today's discussion has set us on that path through a more thoughtful and empathetic action direction. Once again, thanks so much, Lizzie, Ritu, and Amir, and to all of our audience. Let the insights shared today inspire more conversations like this.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting.
Thank you.